everyone, welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and on today's episode, we're focusing on ways we can support kids and young adults who are in what we might call crisis mode. Maybe they're struggling with extreme behaviors, explosive reactions, extreme overwhelm and anxiety. They're not able to move forward in their lives as a result. And if you're parenting or working with someone in crisis like this, no doubt you're feeling overwhelmed, anxious, and are struggling as well. So we're going to talk today with Ron K. Kaufman, who has a wealth of experience on this topic. He's going to help us frame these crisis behaviors as a neuro crash and provide us with proactive and reactive strategies to support kids and young adults who are struggling. Before we get into all that, let me tell you a little bit about Ron. He's an autism thought leader and co-creator of the Autism Crisis Turnaround Protocol, author of the book Autism Breakthrough, the former CEO of Autism Treatment Center of America, and an international lecturer and graduate of the Ivy League's Brown University with a degree in biomedical ethics. His articles have been featured in journals. He's been interviewed by national and international media. And in addition to his work with families and educators for almost 25 years, Ron brings his own personal history, which he's going to talk with us about in just a moment. It's such a thrill to have you here, Ron. Welcome to the show.
Oh, well, thank you, Nicole. I'm super psyched to be here.
So as we were talking before the show, it's been like at least a decade since we've seen each other in person.
Yes.
But we reconnected recently, and I'm so excited about this new focus that you have and the work that you're doing, and just really cannot wait to share this with the audience today. But where I'd love to start actually is with you talking about your personal story, because you really do have a pretty remarkable history, and I'd love for you to share that with all of us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and it's so important to me because, you know, this isn't sort of just either like an academic or career thing, although it is that too. For me, it's so deeply personal. At a young age, I was diagnosed with what they said was severe autism. And when I say severe, I mean, I have like no language, no eye contact, very much enveloped in my own world, my own space. I would do things like rock back and forth and move my fingers in front of my eyes. These are familiar for people who know someone on the spectrum. One of the things I love to do was take kitchen plates and put them on their edge on the floor and spin them over and over again. My parents were told I had an IQ below 30, like really, it was harsh. And they were, and I think what was so had the biggest impact, and I think this is true even today for a lot of parents, is that, you know, the diagnosis tells you what's going on. So great. But then there's this prognosis, which is, I always say, is like somebody's guess about the future, right? And yeah, my parents were told like I would never have friends. I mean, I'd never even prefer people over objects, right? And so I would never be going to like any kind of regular school or living on my own or getting married or anything, or, you know, any of these kind of things that a lot of us take for granted when we first have kids. And my parents did something super amazing in the face of this, which is they took me home. They developed their own very much home-based, child-centered kind of program. They called it the Sunrise Program, but they spelled it S-O-N because I was their son. And they worked with me for a little over 3 years. And I really blossomed and grew in a 1,000 different ways. Like I'm this guy, right, talking to you. But, I went on to do those things that you said. I feel funny saying this, but I know it's important to some people, so I'll say it. Yes, I am married. I have a wonderful wife named Dilma. She's a total rock star and like the best human being I've ever met. So I'm super happy about that. And, but I also just would say that, you know, if you're a parent of a loved one who has special challenges, going through something, you know, I've been where your loved one is. So I know what's going on here. I also really get that your loved one on the spectrum or having other difficulties, they're not the problem. And even I would say their autism or other challenge isn't really the problem either. Those might be challenges, but like if someone's going through a crisis or a difficult, what you were saying was a neuro crash, it's not because of the person, then they're like misbehavior. And it's not even because they're on the spectrum or have another challenge. It's a different factor, which I hope we can talk about. But I feel this very, very personally in my bones. You know what I mean?
You do, because you've lived it, and you've lived it from the personal side of, like you said, being the person with challenges. But then also you've worked so extensively with so many families, with so many professionals. And so you're really attuned to their needs and what's going on for them and the challenges. So I think you just bring such a unique sort of 360 view of this.
Thanks. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will just say a quick comment on that is that like, yeah, I've gotten a chance to work with so many families, and I've really seen what these, not just my parents who helped me with my life, right? But what parents are capable of when they either have the right tools, they aren't being constantly thwarted, and they have this chance to actually help their person who has the challenges. Like it's pretty amazing what their kids can do when they have a parent like that. So I feel like I've seen it, like you said, kind of from 360, from all different angles of what's possible.
Yeah. And unfortunately, our systems are still so set up to disenfranchise parents and families. And, the standard and what is still recommended widely for treatment and intervention for kids when they get these kinds of diagnoses, which is a whole nother show that you and I could do, but really just so devastating. So it flies in the face of what we know really works and takes parents out of the equation, right? Basically says, the prognosis for this is really bad. You don't know what you're doing. You need to turn your kid over to, other people for X bazillion hours a week and let them do something. And it's so devastating, not only for the parents and the families, but also for the child.
Yeah, nobody wins in that equation. You're so right. And I, even today, it's gotten a little better, but I still hear so many parents who get told, oh, well, you're just the mom, or you're just the dad,
right.
or, you are the parent, so you're too emotional. I understand you feel that way, but this is the way it really is. Mm-hmm. And so there's just a constantly little denigrating, move to the side kind of messages. I don't even know if people are intentionally doing that. My hunch is that they're not, like, they're trying to do the best they can, but the way they're communicating that is like super disempowering, like you were saying, to parents.
Yeah. And I know the core of your work is really about helping parents and caregivers understand really what's going on, because there's sort of, as you said, the surface of what we think we know is going on. Like, okay, my child has this label or this behavior, but you're really about like, let's look deeper at what's actually happening here, because that completely shifts the way that we relate to the person and the way that we support them, right?
It really does, Nicole. Actually, it's funny you should say that, because one of the things that comes up in conversation a lot when I'm with people is this idea of like, hey, everyone's coming at this from the outside. They're coming at it from outside the child's, I mean, I don't want to say everyone, of course, many people, let's just say, are coming at it from the outside, and they're sort of looking in. They're trying to, their intent is, of course, to help the child, to help the family, but they're looking at it as like, as a neurotypical person might gaze upon this person in need of help and change, right? And so they're saying like, oh, well, okay, how do we stop this behavior that we don't like? How do we change this thing? How do we get the person to act differently? How do we get the person to do the appropriate thing? And so, but the problem is, I feel really strongly about this, is like, look, it's so important, if we can, to come at this from the inside of like, okay, so what's this person on the spectrum's actual day-to-day lived experience like for them? What does it feel like for them when someone says no, or someone says yes, or they're overstimulated, or like, what does that actually feel like? What is, why do they feel the need to do what they're doing? That's a big, instead of like, how do we change what they're doing? But why do they're doing what they're doing for a reason. Why do they feel that need? And then for me, the third one is this inside question of like, okay, so how do we help this person on the spectrum or with other challenges? How do we help that person to feel a sense of safety, feel at ease, feel a sense of trust, and not be in fight or flight survival mode? Like, how do we do that? Give them that experience. So I feel like, yeah, you're right on the money there with of like, that's the difference between coming at it from the inside and looking at it on the outside. You know what I mean?
Totally. And to go beyond, I hear like a lot of behaviorists, behavior specialists who are like, no, we're looking at the meaning of the behavior, it's avoidance. It's like, no, we have to go even like deeper than that. Like, we're not just talking about those surface level things. We're talking about like what the actual internal experience of the person is. And so I'm so glad that you.
Yes. Oh my gosh, Nicole, I'm so glad you said, because you're right. It's avoidance, right? But then but why are they, there's something, there's a reason why that's happening, right? Why are they avoiding something, right? Yes.
Yeah. Right. It's just, we have to, it's just well timed for us to get beyond those archaic ways of looking at it. So I think this is really what you're talking about when you say, and you mentioned it a few minutes ago, we're blaming the wrong thing. Share a little bit more by what you mean about that.
Oh, well, yes, this is another thing. And specifically when I say we're blaming the wrong thing, I'm referring to when our loved ones, and it could be, I say loved ones because I don't want to keep saying kids, because truly, like, we had a bunch of people in our last program, most of them were parents of 20s and 30-year-olds, although we had parents of 7 and 11-year-olds as well, of course. But yeah, what I feel like happens here is if our loved ones are going through a crisis, which, if I can I back up a little and sort of define that a little bit?
Sure.
So what I see a crisis as, and my colleague Kate C. Wild, she's an author of multiple books, and we've been working together for a long time, and we spent 1.5 years kind of developing this ACT approach, the autism crisis turnaround, and basically it was, so we're thinking of this idea of like, okay, what most people are doing when they have loved ones, and periodically at different points that loved one might go through a crisis. Now, when we're people have all different definitions for crises, and I'm not trying to like enforce my definition, but in terms of what we're trying to aim at to help people with, it's a lot of the things you mentioned at the beginning of our talk, which is like, so they might have someone who's having explosive behaviors or hitting or screaming, or if they're more verbal, they might be swearing or say, I hate you and I hope you die, right? Or all these kind of things, which I never take personally, but I know some people do. And so there's that kind of thing. Then there's like going through transitions like puberty or the death of a loved one or the dissolution of a friendship or a relationship. And then sometimes it manifests not in an explosive behavior, but in what you mentioned, which is just like really intense feelings of anxiety and misery. And it kind of just breaks your heart. And you want to like help this person not be in that space, right? So that's what I'm talking about when I say a crisis. But what a crisis actually is, in my view on this, is like, okay, it's kind of like a repeated neuro crashes that are like causing upheaval and disruption in life. And then if I go to what's a neuro crash, I would say it's when the imposed situation, I'm sorry to define all this, but like the imposed situation is just the environment or circumstance that a person's exposed to, usually without their say-so. So then a neuro crash is when the imposed situations overwhelm that person's brain so that their coping mechanisms shut down. And I just think this is so important because the person with these challenges is already doing a bunch of really smart self-regulation and coping mechanisms. Oftentimes, those are actively thwarted by the people trying to help them. Oh, don't do that. It looks funny or whatever. Don't do that. We're sitting, it's circle time now, so do that. And really, these kinds of coping mechanisms are the only thing standing in between this person and a neuro crash. But even if they're allowed to do these coping things, which is great, I support that, even still, these imposed situations, these buildup of different things that are happening in their environment and to them throughout the day can really build up and then cause this situation where even the coping mechanism isn't powerful enough to ward that off, and the brain starts to like short circuit a bit. That's what I'm calling it, a neuro crash. And basically then you get these sort of explosive or big things happening. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And it also explains why so much of the ways that these things are commonly managed are really ineffective, because a lot of the assumption with dealing with these behaviors is that the person is totally making a decision to do this, right? And what you're really spotlighting here is that no, these behaviors are simply a response to processing circuits in the brain being totally overwhelmed. Neurologically, they're not able to manage. And the behavior that you're seeing is the outgrowth of that. It's not like they're making a choice to be like, you know what, I really just want to aggravate everyone. And I really want to make everyone's life miserable. And I really want to make a scene and have everybody staring at me right now. So I'm going to scream and throw chairs, right? It's like, so I think what you're saying is so important for people to hear and understand. It's a totally different thing that's going on at a neurological level.
Yes. And oh my gosh, I can't even tell you how it warms my soul to hear you say this, because it really is. It's like people treat it off, or at least talk about it as if it's like exactly what if I break that window?
Right.
Yes. And these are not like thought through choices and behavior, right? There's something, exactly what you're saying. There's something happening in the brain. And by the way, the thing happening in the brain also isn't that person's fault.
Nope.
And also, and this is why I say we're blaming the wrong thing too. It's not only not the person's fault, but even the situation itself, like let's say an autism spectrum challenge, right? That people talk about, well, this is a natural. I mean, if you have someone on the autism spectrum, you're going to have this stuff. But actually, autism isn't causing that, right? It's actually the clash between the autism, which isn't causing anything like that, and then these outside imposed situations, which are overloading the brain and causing all sorts of problems. The two biggest, by the way, the two biggest ones that I think, if we're going to blame the right thing, the two biggest things that I feel like are factors here, 2 to 3, is the two biggest would be, sort of building sensory overload. And then also, because our loved ones often have a heightened need for predictability and control, which we all have, but they might have it more.
Yep.
Then that's being continuously disrupted throughout the day. Again, no one's trying to be mean to these people, right? But oftentimes their control and their predictability and their autonomy is taken away in service to other things, right? And so both of those things are building up. One of the things I say a lot to people, because they'll go, oh, I just had someone tell me this. My son really flips out almost whenever his younger brother says almost anything, especially if he's like whining or crying, but sometimes even when he's just talking. So they make a direct one-to-one. So it's something about this younger brother's voice or something else. But actually, what I try and tell this person is, it's not one thing, it's all the things. So yes, that may be the proximate trigger, like, okay, you're seeing that happen. But actually, I would argue that if you had a lot less of this other stuff throughout the day, his ability to tolerate his younger brother's voice might be significantly different. It might really increase and might feel really different for him, right? And so there's this one of the analogies I use for this is, it's like your loved one has a cup. Yep. Your brain is almost like this glass, and we're pouring water into it all day, and it's okay to have some water in it, but that water is different times when their control is challenged, different times when there's sensory stuff going on in their environment, and they can take some of that. But what happens is eventually it's going to fill up, and when it overflows, that's when you get a neuro crash. And so that's why it's not one thing. It's not like it's one of the drops of water. It's all the water being poured in. So if we can pour in less water, or even better, maybe take out some water, right, then even the brother talking or this other thing doesn't have to always be the trigger. Yep. Right. And so we're like, I sort of see it this way. It's like we're blaming the person who's we're blaming someone who's in a really hot room for like clamoring to get out, instead of, hey, it's too hot in this room. Yeah. Or, we're blaming someone who's scratching, like, why are they scratching? Instead of like, hey, their bed's filled with poison ivy. Yeah, that's why they're scratching, right? Yeah. It's not like a behavior that like they're doing to bug you, right? So yes, it's sort of like, if we can I would sort of blame the correct thing, then number one, it takes a bunch of pressure off people, but it also yields a solution to this. It yields, and one last thing I'll just say is that this other thing I see I know, Nicole, you will resonate with your background. You will resonate with this, which is there's just this huge trust deficit that's been built, that builds up because of the different way that our loved ones can often relate and communicate. And so then people aren't meeting them where they are. And so what ends up happening is a trust deficit on the part of the person who's on the spectrum who has another challenge. So then basically what occurs from that is when they start to move toward a crisis, they start to move toward a neuro crash. We call it hitting either their sensory wall or their control wall, when they're sort of hitting their limit of what they can take. Then, of course, the best people to meet them there to try and help them might be their parents or a really good teacher, instructor, a really good OT, right? They're going to be met with, they're the best people for it, but they're going to be met with resistance oftentimes, because there's already this trust deficit where the person who's challenged is seeing this person as a disruptor and a thwarter, even though they're not. They're like coming from love, right? But so now the very person who can most be helpful is going to get met with resistance. So then it comes to, okay, how can we address that too, this trust deficit, so that they're going to be open to us when they most need our help? Does that make, you know what I mean?
It absolutely does. And unfortunately, a lot of times when kids do hit that wall and they then go into a neuro crash, oftentimes if it's at school or, some other places, there isn't even someone in the environment who they've ever really developed a thorough, like a solid foundation of trust with. I had that happen at a situation that should not have blown up like it did at a school yesterday, but it did. And it was because this kid hit that wall, was in, as you're calling it, a neuro crash. And who did they send in to interact with him and deal with it? The security officer from the school who he had never met before, the vice principal who he had never met before, and some guidance counselor who he also had never met before. And it's like, where were the people who he had established at least some level of trust with? And then they wonder why kids escalate and it takes so much longer to come out of it, right? So I think I'm so glad you raised that, because so much of that is our work to do as parents, as caregivers, as professionals, around how do we become who we need to be so that they can trust us and we can develop that foundation of trust. And that's our work. That's not their work.
Oh, that's our work. I love that. That's, oh my gosh, that's so true. One of the things that we at least in our we have something called the ACT live rescue course. This is a live course we do on certain weekends throughout the year. And basically one of the things we talk about is that, so we talk about these 7 main causes of crises. We kind of go through all of them. And one of them is being around someone who is agitated and hasn't built up trust in exactly the way you're saying, but is also like, is agitated and has like an emotional agitation, which is, hey, it's understandable. I'm not going to fault someone for that.
Right.
But what ends up happening is that's another like assaultive sensory experience for our loved ones. And so then we talk about, okay, so that's our part, like what you're saying, like, okay, so what do we need to do? We have ways we address it, but I'm sure you do too. But what do we need to do to help you be in a place where you are at ease enough so that you're not triggering them and you're not triggered by them, and like you can be calm, you can help them feel at ease, and then you can move forward from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really what you're talking about here, and I want to get into those 7 causes. I want people to hear about that, or at least some of them. But what you're really talking about here is us all understanding that how we've tried to manage or proceed with kids or adults with these challenges is to force them to fit into what the world is. And it's like, you need to be able to do that. And there has not been nearly enough recognition of the disconnect between who they are, how their brains operate, and what their needs are, and what we call, quote unquote, normal school, community, home environments. And we haven't had any sort of appreciation for that. So it's sort of been just like this trying to force this fit. And what we're seeing is more and more kids who are having these crashes and going into crisis, not because there's something terribly wrong with them, not because this is something they're doing on purpose, not even because we're bad parents or bad teachers, but because we fundamentally don't have a fit and aren't working towards that fit between neurologically who these individuals are and how the world operates.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, there's that I think of it as the clash between their unique way of experiencing things and the imposed situations that we're insisting on And there's a clash there. If we could just not have that clash, we could solve so much of what's happening with these kinds of crises and neuro crashes. Absolutely. Yeah.
So true. And to people who say, well, that's not realistic. That's not how the world works. Like they need to figure it out. We could do, again, a whole episode on that. But the reality is, how well is it working for your child or your loved one or your student or whoever to continue forcing this and them breaking down and not being able to function? That clearly isn't workable either.
It's really not workable. And, people talk about, I love that you just said that, because I hear that all the time. But the world, but they have to adjust to the world, right? And I'm like, wait, this world that you're talking about also, like even beyond just autism or special needs, right? This is a world, like I really feel like, no joke. So how there's all these videos now of like a flight attendant politely asks someone to put on a mask. I'm not going to get political, don't worry. But like they ask someone to put on a mask and that person loses their mind, right? And it circulates around the internet and everyone's like, what, look at the overreaction. And then that's a big one, overreaction. And what I feel like is like we are experiencing the first like mass neuro crashing happening.
Yes.
I really believe. So people think it's because the flight attendant asked this person to put on that. I'm like, dude, that was the trigger. Yes. But there was a whole day or week or month of stuff that just built up to that. That person was like an inch away from their wall. And then, so when you asked them to put on their mask, you basically took some control from them on the plane, let's say. By the way, I want them to wear a mask on the plane, but still, I'm having this sense of like, hey, there's all, and not just in planes, right? There's people flipping out in Walmarts, right? And on every side of it, this isn't just one type of person doing this.
Right.
What I'm saying is it's like, I really feel like people that are like dubbed neurotypical are having tons of these neuro crashes.
Yes.
And so this, like, that's why I say this sort of like real world that everyone has to adjust to, ain't nobody adjusting to it. Like there's really big problems happening right now that aren't being addressed.
Oh man, that is so true. We are collectively in a worldwide like neuro crash epidemic here and really like that's what I've been saying to families and even my professional colleagues and to patients over the last, now like 20 months of this whole thing. It's like, nope, this is really a normal response to a totally abnormal situation. And I think framing it in that way is just so important because it takes the focus off of there's something wrong with you or there's something wrong with me. It's like, no, there's something wrong with the situation. And let's look at how we can deal with that differently.
Yes. Yeah. Could we change that in such a way that it's not a constant trigger for people?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, you shared that one of these sort of causes that you feel like is behind these neuro crashes. You talked about like sensory overwhelm. I think you've mentioned like a couple of them, but let's have you just share as many as you're open to sharing, just so that parents and caregivers can just get an idea of, what are some of the things that really can lead to this?
Yes, I can actually whip through all 7 pretty quick.
Oh, great. Okay, perfect.
But if I could, just as a lead into that,
yeah.
I could make just this one point, which is like, if being aware of this kind of stuff can be so helpful because we have this other term we use in the ACT protocol that we call, you want to look for SOS, which stands for something. It stands for signals of stress.
Yes.
And we actually even named the skill of getting good at that, because actually I don't feel like a lot of people have been helped to get good at that. So people are missing a lot of stuff. But we call that skill socioception, which is the ability to really detect SOS so that you can really detect your loved one's stress level and their boundaries way before a neuro crash is going to happen, way when they're like 10 feet from the wall and not just when they're an inch from the wall. Right. And so I just want to say, because this is so important, there's obvious ones that everyone sees. These are the ones that our loved ones do like right before they hit the wall. Right. They might like be covering their ears. And so people are like, oh, something's wrong. But there's a bunch of more subtle ones that happen way earlier that are so important to like start to get good at perceiving. They can be anything from like literally clenching of a jaw muscle. I see a lot of kids making fists, not fists to hit, just fists at their sides.
Yeah.
They're like, because they're just dude, they're trying so hard. They're actually, and this is the thing, everyone blames them for the neuro crash. They are trying so hard not to have the neuro crash. You think they want to have the neuro crash? You think that's some fun, pleasant experience? Of course it isn't, right? They're suffering as much as the people on the other side of it, right? So they're trying really hard not to have it. I mean, and that's why they're not having it every second, right? They're trying it really hard not to have it. And so they're doing all these things. And we can be aware of these signals. We can be aware of changes in breathing. Again, we're not really trying to be observant in that way. Right? I have people all the time saying it was just out of the blue or it was an overreaction, when actually I guarantee you it's not out of the blue. Like there's a bunch of signals, and it's not an overreaction because they're not really reacting to that thing you think they're reacting to. So the better we can get at perceiving all of we have a huge list. We have like pages of it where we have people do checklists in the course so they can really start to get good at it. And actually first we have people do it on themselves. Yeah. We have our own SOS too, right?
Right. And people are notoriously bad at even being aware of that for themselves. So yeah, I love that. First, tuning into our own experience. What are we noticing about our stress response?
Yes.
Yeah.
And like it goes, again, we could have a whole 1 hour conversation just on this, because I'm thinking of like all the couples that don't, neurotypical couples aren't seeing their loved ones SOS as they're building. Like there's so much of this, right? I can talk about this all.
Right.
But anyway, in terms of with our loved ones with challenges, they're having some SOSs that Kate and I have seen for years. Like we know exactly what these things look like. So we're trying to get people really good at seeing that. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a little bit of time. Yeah. But so then if you can get good at that, you can address these 7 things, which I can just whip through real quick. So I'll just say them really quick. So one I mentioned already, right? Just being around someone who is emotionally agitated.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Number 2 is being pushed. And I don't mean physically, although I hope that's not happening. Right. But I mean emotionally pushed. And there's 3 main ways that happens. One is the no isn't respected. Someone's saying no, no, no. Yes, yes, yes. We're doing it anyway. Right. And even if they can't verbalize no, usually they're expressing no. Right. They're frowning. They're pushing us away. Like we know they mean no. Right. Yeah. Another is we're trying to get them to do something like, let's say, homework or sitting at the dinner table, because that's what you're supposed to do is sit at the dinner table, and they don't want to do it. So we're like pushing them to do that. And then another, which I call the enemy of autism, is, and I think everyone will resonate with this, which is rushing. Oh my gosh, rushing's like the worst thing you could do if you have someone with special needs. And you don't need me to tell you that. Anybody listening knows that. Like we see that, everybody sees that. Because it brings in a lot of these problems, the agitation, because we're like, I know how I am when I'm rushing. I'm a freak when I'm rushing.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all just under being pushed. Then there's like invasion of personal space, which is everything from unwanted affection when we try and like hug and kiss our loved ones and they don't want it. Picking them up and moving them if they're smaller. And then another part of this same thing is I call it taking their stuff. Dude, don't take their stuff. Yeah. If they hold something in their hands or they have a favorite thing and we're constantly like pulling that out of their hands. So that's another thing. Then there's sensory overload, which we've been talking about, but I just want to say that one thing I talk about a lot with that has to do with, we call it S4, but it just basically means super sensitive sensory systems, which you'll resonate with. Yeah. And basically all the different things that put a stressor on that we might not be aware of. And then number 5 is unpredictability. And I'm talking about our unpredictability. Like, think about it, right? We're in different moods each day. We say dinner's at 6, but then we work late one night, so dinner's at 7 that night. Neurotypicals are known to lie sometimes. So there's all these different ways where we're not super predictable. And then number 6 is blurry boundaries, which is interesting because what I often see is a combination of way too many boundaries and then inconsistent enforcement of them.
Yes.
So we always try and say, like, you want way less boundaries, but you have to be 100% consistent with those few boundaries that you have. Yeah. And then the last one is, I like, this is another term we've been using, which is what we call a biostorm, which is basically it has biological, but also the characteristics of a storm, meaning like it's super explosive, but it also passes. Yeah. And that could be triggered by anything from something that was eaten to, I've had some dryer sheets like can cause that. Like all different kinds of things, smells. You know, people think when you're, this is going to be a little gross, but people think when you smell poop, like that happens by magic. Yeah. But actually, in order to smell poop, there's microparticles of poop in the air that you must smell. So if I had one family where they had their loved one had a lot of neuro crashes on Fridays for some reason. They didn't know why. And we tracked it back and they're like, oh, that's the day the house gets cleaned. So there's just tons of microparticles now in the air from all these detergents and stuff that are using. That's like already like, okay, so that makes it really hard for them to function that day. So they're going to have more neuro crashes that day. Absolutely. I'll just say this too. Listen to this. This is a combination of sensory overload, but I just talked to this mom. This was just a week ago. She had a 32-year-old and every 3 meals a day for over a decade, it was like giant meltdowns and neuro crashes every single time. Like think about for both of them, it must have been horrible living like that. Right. So it's so she takes actually our live course and she walks into the kitchen. She just closes her eyes without him there. She's just and she realizes she can hear the hum of the refrigerator and she can also smell all of the cleaning from the dishes that were done ages ago, but she can still smell it. And so she just starts to do something really simple. She just starts to have the meals in his bedroom instead, right? And literally nothing, like no problems, no meltdowns, no neuro crashes. What after over a decade of this, 3 times a day, right? So it's like, okay, so now we've changed the imposed situation, like you're saying. We've now matched it to like, and now we're not dropping him into a situation 3 times a day it's completely triggering for him and completely hurtful to his brain and his experience. And hey, he's not going to have a neuro crash every second when you do that.
Yeah. Oh, and it strikes me as you're talking through all of these, which great list, by the way, love those 7. I think that's so right on. It strikes me that this really involves us making a shift to getting curious, and being willing to step outside of the realm of our own experience and perception and consider and perceiving things through the lens of our loved one. And so rarely do we really talk about that. And so rarely do people do that. It's like, nope, this is what's happening. This is my perception of it. I'm not bothered by the kitchen. I don't know what your problem is. Everyone else is just fine sitting here and eating, right? And so it's that getting curious and that being willing to say, there's got to be a reason here. Let me set my own experience and perception aside and try to understand what your experience of this is.
Yeah. Yeah, like I'm feeling you big time, Nicole. Like, because yes, that's and look, that's hard for a lot of people, right? Yeah. That's not where everyone's like naturally coming from, and especially if they have someone in their life who has a lot of special challenges, right. They're often in crisis mode of like they're trying to run around, put out fires, or get this person to conform in a certain way, and so they're not seeing that. But that what you just said is so crucial. Oh my gosh, so important.
So I know we're going to have to wrap up here in a few minutes, but I want to share, I think, this has just been such a great conversation and you've given really just such an important shift for our listeners to make and how they think about this. I wonder if you could leave people with, a tip or two, something, if somebody's thinking like, okay, wow, I get this now. Like I have not understood this before and I'm going to start trying to be more aware and better understand what's happening here. Is there a starting point or a tip that you would share with parents and caregivers around maybe how to make themselves a more trustworthy person, or maybe it's somewhere else that you start, something that they could take and say, I'm really going to work at this?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you asked that. Sure, I do. Sure, absolutely. So one of the things to note is actually before people, let's say, go to the live course, they can take it, and if they buy them at the same time, this other thing I'm about to say is free if they buy it separately. But it's basically just a little online, almost like a pre-course course. It's called the Autism Crisis Lifeline, and it gives them, because a lot of people don't want to wait, let's say, whatever, a month or even a week for this. So we want to give them some things to do. So I can think of some things from there. Couple of things. One is something we call eliminating. So we have these 5 turnaround tools, which are the main things we focus on helping people. One of them, the second one, as it turns out, the first one is called use socioception. It's all about getting good at recognizing the SOS that we were talking about. The second one is called ceasefire. And it's all about changing these control battles, because these control battles are massively contributing to these neurocrashes. So a lot of people feel like I can't give as like, because we advocate giving more control in a bunch of different ways, but a lot of people just aren't ready for that as a first step. They just can't get there. Right. So we start with this idea of like, okay, let's eliminate some of the big battlefields first. We call it eliminating the battlefield. So if you're always having a battle over, they raid the freezer and they eat all the ice cream, even if there's a gallon of it, right? Okay, so we could not have ice cream in the house for a little while, right? We could, even if it's the whole fridge, we could actually put a lock on the fridge. This way, it's not, we're not saying like, hey, don't touch that. Hey, I told you not to do that. Hey, hey, give me that back. And now I'm going to tug of warring with that.
Yeah.
Just taking away the whole battlefield. Like there's no field for us to have a battle on.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So there's that I feel like is important.
Right.
So go through, we have a checklist, but people can start this on their own. Like just looking through like, okay, what are the biggest things we have these battles over? Can I actually just remove, like I have someone, my kid's always writing on the walls. Okay, could we not have markers all over the place? then you don't have to grab the markers from them. There's just nothing to write on the walls with. So, hey, the problem is solved, right? So there's that piece. And I was going to say something else. Oh, another piece. I just want to say one other thing. This is part of the very final, the fifth turnaround tool, which is something that we call nurture more, but it has to do with using these things. So I'm sure, Nicole, you're familiar with the very famous book about the 5 love languages, right? People, right? Of course, right? So everyone's familiar with that. So what we did is in this thing, we called it the 5 autism love languages. And they're things you do. You don't do them during a neuro crash. There's not the time. But you do them in between the neuro crash, in all the times that we could be using to do what you just said, which is build more, get rid of the trust deficit, build more trust there. And these are things like, there's a bunch of different ones, but there's one of the things I say a lot is lots of people are helping our loved ones, but very few people are helping them in a way that feels like help to them. Lots of people are loving our loved ones, but very few are loving them and caring for them in a way that feels like love and caring to them. So how can we express love and caring to them in a way, in a language they can digest, in a way that feels like that? So it includes things, I'll just give you some very quick examples, like interest in their interest. So instead of constantly trying to get them to move on from talking about airplanes, we need to become airplane fanatics. We need to get really into airplanes, right? So one is interest in their interests. Another is what we call immediate responsiveness. So very oftentimes when they finally do put things together enough to really try and communicate with us, we're busy, we're this, I'll do it in a minute. I'm going to cook dinner first. I'm going to do this. It's really important, again, unless there's an emergency and you can't, to like try and be responsive to their actual reaching out as quickly as we can. There's obviously things like words of support, ways we can talk to them that is very supportive. And there's even things like, what was the one I had? There's this too. We are often unaware of what our faces look like. Friendly face. But basically, it's so important to have a friendly face. People talk about, I'm going to just say on the spectrum specifically, people talk about people on the spectrum like they say mind blindness, and they don't understand other people and how any other they don't have empathy, right? But what I feel like is that when I'm working with people on the spectrum, they're way better detectors of this stuff than like I can act like I'm in a good mood for my neurotypical friends, and if I'm good, and if I'm really putting attention to it, I can fool them and they can think I'm having a good day. I cannot do that with the people on the spectrum I work with. I don't care how many. So it's really important, all these little nonverbal ways that this stuff leaks out. We have to come back to like putting ourselves in a place where we're having a friendly face, and all the little signals that tell us that we're either angry or accepting, that we're in a bad mood or a good, that we're dangerous or we're safe. It's really important to monitor and then put those on the surface so that our loved ones can feel safe. There's a Dr. Stephen Porges, I don't know if you've heard of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Perception of safety,
That's right? Yeah.
Really important. And one of the things he says too is that had this quote, which is the feeling of safety is the therapy. It's not some side thing that we have to get out of the way so that we can get to the business of, It's like, that is the therapy. That is so important. If our loved ones can really feel safe and at ease, not be in fight or flight, that's the key.
Oh, I love that. And that really is all under our control, because we can be in charge of being aware of and managing our own emotions and our responses to those emotions. And that, yeah, that's so powerful. I love this. I could, talk to you for 5 more hours, and maybe we'll need to have you back, because this is such a just really incredible and such a helpful conversation. I do want to make sure that people know where they can find out more about the work that you're doing, particularly around ACT, the autism crisis turnaround. And I would just say, I think that you would agree, but correct me if I'm wrong, even for people listening who are like, well, my child doesn't have a diagnosis of autism, but all of this sounds very much like my kid, like that's okay, right? For what the work that you're doing is applicable to lots of different kinds of people. But I want to make sure that they know where to go to get more info, and also about the live class that you have coming up in a couple of weeks.
Sure. I'll just give two quick things. So one is, they can just go to autismcrisisturnaround.com. Right. Just autism crisis. There's a lot of information there. And then that we do have what's called because we put it together, it's ACT, right? It's called the ACT protocol. By the way, it is a protocol, not a program. So there's programs like RDI and like the Sunrise program that are good long-term developmental programs. This is only designed to, like, you learn it, you take 2 to 3 weeks to really implement it to get this kind of turnaround to happen. Right. So that's it's compatible with anything that you're doing long-term. Yeah. But anyway, they can take the ACT Live Rescue course. Mm-hmm. And basically that's an all-day Saturday, Sunday course, which happens over Zoom. It's super helpful. We have lots of Q&A, and Kate and I teach that together. And basically the next one that's coming up for people that are listening to this is November 13th and 14th. That's a Saturday and Sunday. And they can actually go to the autismcrisisturnaround.com to register for it.
Awesome. And that's great. I want to encourage everybody to do that. And even on the website, you've got, as you mentioned, that free, really helpful intro video. You've got lots of tools and things there as well. So just really want to encourage people to go to the website, check out what you've got going there. Ron, I thank you for spending the time with us today, first of all, but also more than that, just thank you for the really important incredible work that you are doing around these issues. It's so needed, and we're all just really blessed by the fact that you're willing to use your personal experience and your professional experience to do all of this work and to share it with us. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. And right back at you. I know we haven't talked in 10 years, but I have been following your work, and I'm in your corner 1,000%. I love what you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you, as always, to all of you for being here, for listening. We will catch you back here next time.